Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Ballotpedia's webinar on our May 8th primaries review. Last night was a huge night for primary elections. There were statewide races in Indiana, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Ohio. So today we'll be talking through some of the most important results from that batch of races and spending a little bit of time looking forward to the next round of primaries. Joining me today to talk about all these exciting results is Dave Bowden, a project lead with Ballotpedia. Dave, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's great to be here.
All right, so let's dive right into it. Like I said, there were 4 statewide primaries happening last night. Heading into yesterday, separate from the results, what did you think would be the most important individual races?
As you can see, we had a lot of these Republican primaries in our top 10 lists. And there was a whole lot of discussion about the Senate primaries in both West Virginia and Indiana, a slew of House races, and then, of course, the Ohio governor's race.
Awesome. So like you said, that was a lot of Republican races this week. Before we dive into the results, were you watching anything in particular on the Democratic side?
There was really nothing that rose to the level of all of those GOP primaries. There were a few interesting races. Any statewide race for an open seat in a swing state like Ohio is noteworthy. So you had a Democratic primary for governor of that state, although Richard Cordray won that rather easily. There were also a couple of primaries on the Democratic side for a couple of House seats, which should be competitive in November, like in North Carolina 9 and the Ohio 12th District Special. But like the Ohio governor's race, neither was all that close.
Okay, and yeah, we'll talk a little bit about some Democratic primaries coming up next week as more of states with more important Democratic primaries begin to hold their races. You mentioned North Carolina 9, so let's move on to that. What's the biggest story of the night? You mentioned there was a lot of attention around those U.S. Senate primaries in Indiana and West Virginia. But I understand there was a big first of this primary season in a congressional race in North Carolina.
Yes, indeed there was. We saw our first incumbent U.S. House member lose in the primary, and that was Representative Robert Pittenger. He lost to Mark Harris by about 800 votes, which was a rematch of their 2016 primary, which Pittenger narrowly won by about 150 votes. So both candidates tried to portray themselves as being closest to Trump, and Pittenger was really attacked for supporting the $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill, which President Trump signed in March. And if you recall, Trump signed the bill, but then subsequently voiced his reservations because it didn't sufficiently fund his border wall. And then Harris was able to campaign against Pittenger on that issue. Harris will now face the Democratic nominee, and even though this district supported Trump by 20 points in 2016, that Democratic nominee, Dan McCready, is very highly thought of, and National Democrats are very interested in this race. This should be very closely contested, especially since you now no longer have an incumbent there.
Well, if Harris makes it through that general election, I know I'm very much looking forward to a third rematch between Harris and Pittenger in 2020. So I'll keep my fingers crossed for that because that'll be a great story. But going into the night, like we said, the biggest races that we expected would be the Senate primaries in Indiana and West Virginia. Indiana might have been a little more surprising than people expected, but West Virginia, I don't think people got quite the surprise that there was a lot of talk about in the lead up to the race. So tell us about those 2 Senate primaries.
Yeah, those 2 Senate primaries are actually kind of similar because they both featured 3 candidates each, and there was one outsider in each. And in Indiana, the outsider actually won. Self-funding businessman Mike Braun defeated 2 congressmen, Representative Luke Messer and Todd Rokita. Braun spent a lot of his money on ads to increase his name recognition, and he did some rather humorous ads painting both Messer and Rokita as interchangeable. So he portrayed himself as the businessman and as an outsider. He behaved more like a conventional candidate, but he definitely wanted to differentiate himself from those 2 congressmen. Messer and Rokita are longtime rivals. They attacked each other early in their campaign ads, and a lot of folks feel that left an opening for Braun. So now Braun will face the Democratic incumbent Joe Donnelly in the general election. Over in West Virginia, you had State Attorney General Patrick Morrisey defeated the coal mining executive Don Blankenship and another congressman, Evan Jenkins. And in this race, there was heavy spending from outside satellite groups that had ties to both the Republican and the Democratic national parties. The Democrats actually, through some of these satellite organizations, got involved a little bit here, which sometimes happens. The big story, I think, in the last few days before the primary was the emergence of Blankenship's candidacy. He had made controversial statements both throughout the campaign and in his advertisements. There were also some current Republican senators who had expressed reservations of having him, Blankenship, be the nominee. He had served a year in prison because of his involvement in conspiring to violate federal mine safety standards as a result of an accident that happened at one of his mines. And even on Monday, you had President Trump stepping in and calling for Republican voters not to support Blankenship because he was concerned that Blankenship would not fare as well in the general. So all of that added together helped Morrisey to win this primary. And in what will be a very closely watched race, he will take on Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, which will probably be, one of the most closely watched Senate races in the whole cycle.
Yeah, I think we can expect both of those to be competitive. I believe there were some folks who do race ratings saying that the Indiana race with Braun in it is a true toss-up election, and President Trump did very well in West Virginia 2 years ago, so we can expect that to be very competitive in the challenge to Manchin. So those will be exciting races to watch for the rest of the year. There were a handful of other Indiana and West Virginia Senate races on your top 10 list, including a few with House incumbents running where those House incumbents had retired to run in the Senate races we just talked about. Can you tell us about those?
Sure, and interestingly, as we mentioned with talking about Indiana and West Virginia, all three of the congressmen that gave up their seats to run for the Senate, all of them lost. So you'll have three new folks in those seats. In Todd Rokita's old district, Indiana 4, you had a state representative, Jim Baird, who defeated 6 other candidates to win the nomination. And one of the candidates that he defeated was Steve Braun, who was the brother of Mike Braun, who won the Senate nomination for the Republican side. So State Representative Jim Baird won that primary in Indiana 4. It's a pretty solid Republican district, so Baird should win the election there in November. Messer's old district in Indiana 6 used to be Vice President Mike Pence's district from 2003 until he ran for governor in 2012. And that race was won by Greg Pence, who was Mike Pence's older brother. And again, this is a solid Republican district in Indiana, so Greg Pence is very likely will join his brother in Washington, D.C. Coming up in 2019. Now, we had this rated as a top Republican primary due to the presence of another businessman, Jonathan Lamb, who self-funded a large chunk of his campaign and ran as an outsider against Pence. But the primary wasn't really all that close. Pence got 65% of the vote. And in this case, it was clear that the Republican voters in this district chose a candidate with clear Washington connections rather than an outsider. Kind of the flip side of what happened in the Senate race. Then finally, in West Virginia's 3rd district, which is in the southern part of the state, you had a very competitive primary, which was won by State Delegate Carol Miller. She got just under 24% of the vote, and all the way down to the 4th place finisher got just over 18%. So it was a very close race. The top 4 candidates were all very close. Not surprisingly, most of these candidates here campaigned on their support of Trump, their support of coal mining, and the Second Amendment. And Trump actually carried this district by almost a 50% margin in his presidential run in 2016. But it is somewhat of an ancestrally Democratic area. So although Miller will be favored as the Republican, the Democratic nominee is State Senator Richard Ojeda, and he defeated an incumbent to win his seat in 2016. He seems to be a pretty solid campaigner, so this might be one to watch. There's going to be a lot of interest and a lot of activity with the Manchin-Morrissey Senate race, so this one also could be very interesting as well.
It's fascinating that all three of those congressmen who gave up their seats to run in the Senate races, none of them were able to win. And further to how those set up interesting races in the districts that they gave up. So we then had 3 Ohio races on the list of top 10 primaries, including the Republican primary for governor. Tell us a little bit about that race, which now, with the candidates are through, will feature some nationally known candidates.
Yeah, the Ohio governor's race had nationally known candidates really on both parties. But in the end, the races weren't all that competitive, but it does set up a really fascinating matchup for November. The Republican gubernatorial primary was one of our top 10 primaries, largely because it became very bitter and personal between the two candidates. Current state attorney general Mike DeWine, he's also was a former senator and also a former lieutenant governor, and he ran against the current lieutenant governor Mary Taylor. And as has been a recurring theme in a lot of these campaigns so far, both candidates on the Republican side argue that the other just wasn't conservative enough. Interestingly, Taylor also ran away from the support of her current boss, who's Governor John Kasich. She essentially spurned his endorsement. She also said that she would roll back Kasich's Medicaid expansion in Ohio, which is something that has been kind of a cornerstone of his national policy efforts. But in the end, DeWine was backed by a lot of the folks in the Ohio Republican Party, and he won 60% to 40%, pretty convincingly. The contest that's setting up now for Ohio governor is going to be very interesting. It's a rematch of the 2010 Attorney General's race in Ohio, where Cordray was the incumbent and DeWine unseated him by less than a 1% margin. Most people feel that Ohio has become a little bit more Republican since then, so that works in DeWine's favor. But 2010 was also not a very good year for Democrats. It was the first midterm after Obama's election. And so that headwind for Cordray shouldn't be there. And most people are expecting that Trump's first midterm election this year in 2018 may be a better Democratic year. So as close as that 2010 matchup was between DeWine and Cordray, this one could be just as tight, and it will be probably pretty expensive too, where you have the Columbus, you have the Cincinnati and the Cleveland media markets. This is going to be a very closely watched race.
Yeah, and on top of that, compared to a 2010 Attorney General's race, Cordray has become sort of a national name in heading the CFPB, and the sort of differences he's had with a few months ago with President Trump appointing new leadership at the CFPB and how that all played out. So he's definitely become sort of a national figure, and that'll be interesting to see how that plays. There were also 2 House races in the top 10 list in Ohio, the 12th and 16th districts.
Yes, and what's interesting about both of these cases, and why I was glad that they were on our top 10 list, is that they represented a kind of a clear ideological battle within some of the candidates that were participating. And in these 2 cases, both nominees were the more business-friendly candidate. So you have Ohio's 12th district, where there was primaries for both the regular election and also a special election, which is going to be coming up in August for the seat that was held by Pat Tiberi. And that primary on the Republican side was won by State Senator Troy Balderson. It was a very large field. There were 9 candidates in it. Balderson was backed by the former office holder, Tiberi, and also by the Republican Main Street Partnership, which generally supports more moderate, more pragmatic candidates. The second place finisher was businesswoman Melanie Lengahan, who she really embraced President Trump. She was backed by the more conservative House Freedom Caucus. So there was kind of a clear battle there between a more business-friendly candidate and a more conservative one. And the more business-friendly candidate, Balderson, won that race by less than 1%, about 650 votes. The Democratic Party was won by the Franklin County Recorder, Danny O'Connor. This has usually and historically been a solidly Republican district, but a lot of the rating agencies have this Ohio 12th special election, which is, I think, August 7th, rated either toss-up or leans Republican, given how the Democrats have performed in the special elections that have taken place so far in the cycle. In the other Ohio race was the 16th district, and it was won by a former Ohio State University football player named Anthony Gonzalez, who had been supported by Florida Senator Marco Rubio, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. He beat State Representative Christina Hagan, who was also backed by the House Freedom Caucus, and she was also supported by former Trump administration officials like Anthony Scaramucci and Seb Gorka. So again, the more business-friendly candidate defeated somebody that was endorsed by the more conservative wings of the party. This 16th, the Ohio 16th, is a pretty solid Republican district. So I think Gonzalez will be very heavily favored in the general.
Interesting. So we'll bring it all back full circle. We started with North Carolina's 9th and the first congressional incumbent to lose their party's primary this year. There was one other North Carolina race in the top 10 list. That was, tell us about the North Carolina 3rd district race. Sorry, I blanked on the number there.
Yeah, no problem. This was another North Carolina incumbent that faced a pretty substantial challenge, just like Pinninger in the 9th. Walter Jones is the incumbent in North Carolina 3. He faced two challengers who were very critical of some of his votes that were contrary to President Trump's agenda. So Jones voted against the president's proposal to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, in 2017. He was also one of 12 Republican House members who voted against the tax cuts, also in 2017. But Jones won his primary last night, possibly due to the fact that he had two pretty strong opponents who may have split the vote against him or the anti-incumbent vote. They attacked Jones for not being sufficiently supportive of President Trump, and combined they took 57% of the vote, but Jones received 43%, and he survived. And the threshold for a runoff in North Carolina is only 30%, so Jones was able to win the nomination without getting a majority. Jones also said during the campaign that this was his last election. He will not run again. He was first elected in 1994, so he will have ended up serving over 20 years. But I think we have the makings of our first competitive primary in 2020, because I think both of Jones's challengers will probably be battling to replace him in the next election cycle.
And then depending on what happens in the 9th, if Pittenger makes it through, and maybe we'll get another Harris-Pittenger primary, and we'll already have two North Carolina races on our 2020 top 10 primaries list. It never stops. We're on our way. So thinking about all of these races that we looked at last night, do you see any trends between these different results, or is there any story that stands out as most interesting to you?
I think for me, all the talk about Republican primary voters maybe continuing to embrace non-traditional candidates after President Trump won in 2016. I think what stands out for me is that the Republican nominees who won most of our featured primaries were fairly typical candidates. Braun was an outsider. He won in Indiana against two incumbent congressmen, so that might be a little bit unusual. But the Republican Party has a history of sometimes nominating businessmen outsider candidates. One that comes to mind is Senator Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. So many of the other GOP primary winners campaigned a lot like traditional Republican candidates Republicans who may be less supportive of Trump, there's been talk that if they're stepping back from being strongly identified with the Republican Party, maybe not so enthusiastic about voting in the primaries, that would kind of open the door for much more conservative candidates to end up winning these primaries and being the nominee. But that didn't really happen yesterday. In fact, there were even several instances where there was, pretty direct head-to-head matchups between a business-friendly candidate and a more conservative candidate that was backed by, say, the House Freedom Caucus. And in a fair number of those cases, the business-friendly candidates won. That doesn't mean that Trump still isn't going to be a strong factor and still isn't a strong factor in these Republican primaries, but just embracing him or his agenda is not enough. On the Democratic side, I don't think there's much to take away from yesterday just because there weren't the races. Most of the party's primaries weren't all that contentious or competitive, and they didn't really signal where the party's primary voters are right now. But there are some key House races coming up later this month. Pennsylvania 7, Nebraska 2, Kentucky 6. These will be much more illustrative about where the Democratic Party is, or at least where their primary voters are in terms of picking their nominees.
Yeah, so for sort of our last question here, let's use it as an opportunity to look forward to next week. We're really in the heart of primary season right now. We have statewide races next week on the 15th, and then the following week on May 22nd. So are there any high-profile races happening on those days that we should be looking out for as the next 2 Tuesdays approach?
Yeah, definitely. There are congressional primaries next Tuesday in Pennsylvania, which will be very interesting, especially since these are all new districts after the state Supreme Court ordered the boundaries redrawn earlier this year. The Democratic primary in the Allentown-based 7th, which I just mentioned, really features candidates representing competing wings of the party. It also figures to be a very competitive district in the general election. It's a real pickup opportunity for Democrats, so the outcome of the primary will have a very big impact on their chances in the general. There's also a similar situation in Nebraska's 2nd district, where you have the former Congressman Brad Ashford, who was considered a conservative Democrat when he did serve in the House. And he faces Kara Eastman, who is backed by many local unions and groups like the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. Ashford lost the seat in 2016 to the current Republican incumbent by just a 1% margin. And if Democrats are going to take control of the House this year, they're probably going to have to win back seats like this one. So the primary will showcase the party ideology difference in the Democratic Party, and it will also be very impactful for the general election. So there's a handful of those races coming up later this month on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, there are a couple of congressional primaries of interest in Pennsylvania, and there's also the race to succeed Representative Raul Labrador, who's running for governor of Idaho. These may give us some clue or more clue about the ideological leanings of Republican primary voters, but they're all in pretty solidly Republican districts, so they won't be nearly as impactful for the general election.
Dave, thank you for all of this really helpful, really useful information. It's exciting that we are, like I said, in the heart of the primary season right now. It's just going to keep going at least through until we get a small break in July, and then it's going to be straight through to the general election in November. And Ballotpedia is going to be tracking what happens in all of these primaries in the months to come. So stay tuned to ballotpedia.org for updates on all of these upcoming exciting primaries, and stay in the know as well with our newsletters, including our daily brew, a short daily update, the weekly tap,